Hello. I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and the consequences of that Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. Now, this comes straight after the Potsdam Conference, really. Remembering that at the end of the Second World War, the Russians had moved into Germany from the east and the Allies from the west. And in each of the countries that the Soviets had liberated, they left some troops. Now, there are basically three causes of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. The first of which is the fear of invasion. You have to remember that Russia had been invaded twice in 25 years by the Germans. You know, 1914 with the First World War and 1941 in the Second World War. And they wanted to stop this happening again and get a bit sick of it, really. Also, the second cause, is that Stalin had felt that actually the Allies had agreed to a Soviet sphere of influence. That was agreed, remember, at Yalta and at Potsdam in Eastern Europe. And thirdly, that Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone. Now, I think that's a really key word to use in your examinations because it does show some really good historical terminology. A buffer zone of satellite states. That basically means a zone surrounding Russia made up of friendly communist countries. And that would act as a buffer, a bit like on the back of a train or the front of a train, to absorb any invasions maybe. And therefore the fighting could take place in the buffer zone. And that kind of links to the first cause of Soviet expansion, that fear of invasion. Plus, it's less likely to be invaded if you're surrounded by friendly countries. So, Russia had been invaded twice in 20-odd years. It had lost 20 million people in the Second World War. And what it wanted was friendly, socialist, communist governments around the Soviet Union. And it also wanted to spread communism. And that's because it wants to spread communism to have friendly communist governments all around Russia. So those are three causes. Fear of invasion, sphere of influence guaranteed by the Allies, and thirdly, to create a buffer zone of friendly states. So, how on earth did Stalin go about creating this buffer zone? Well, there's basically a pattern. As I mentioned earlier, when the Russians liberated these countries during the Second World War, they stationed troops there as they moved on into the next country, the next country, the next country. And so they constantly left groups of soldiers in each of these liberated countries. So there was already a military presence there. And the second thing they did is they set up coalition governments. Now, a coalition government is a government made of different political parties. So you may have communists and liberals and maybe conservatives or nationalists. And they share power, very much like we have in the UK at the minute with the conservatives and the liberals. The third thing was, once the communists were in the coalition government, the communists took certain key jobs. They took over the civil service. Sorry, looking the wrong way into the webcam. The civil service, the media. But by far the two most important areas they took over were security, i.e. the police, and defence, i.e. the army. And that now meant that actually they had some force, some power within the countries. The fourth thing they did was they used their jobs as civil servants and in security, the police, and in defence to arrest opposition leaders on various trumped-up charges. And then they held brand new elections straight afterwards. But the thing is, those elections were rigged so that the communists won. And it could be rigged so that outside the polling booths were Soviet soldiers all locked and loaded and intimidating. It could be that they actually just fixed the elections completely and just filled them with their voting papers. And once they'd won the rigged election, they created people's democracies. So the stages are leave troops, set up a coalition, fill the coalition key positions with communists, arrest leaders, fix elections, create a people's democracy. All right? So that's a pattern that they generally follow throughout the period. They did this in Poland with rigged elections in 1947. In Romania, where the communists won 80% of the election, or the votes in an election in 1946. They did it in Hungary, where the leaders were arrested in 1947. and they banned all other opposition parties. They did it in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, but they didn't. They didn't do it in Yugoslavia. And that's very important. Now, Yugoslavia is a communist state, it was a communist state. The difference is it was never liberated by the Soviets. It was liberated by Marshal Tito and the Yugoslav resistance. And as a result, there was no Soviet presence in Yugoslavia. Quite important to know that. It's a bit of the odd one out of Eastern Europe. So we've had a look at the causes of Soviet expansion, why Stalin wanted to do it, and we've had a look at how the Soviets did this. So the third thing, obviously, is the results of Soviet expansion. Now, funnily enough, Britain and America were a little bit worried by this Soviet expansion. It certainly wasn't what they'd envisaged when they said that Stalin could have a sphere of influence. They kind of figured he'd have a little bit of influence, not absolute control, not total domination of Eastern European states. Second thing is that Truman, who's the new president of America, remember, saw it as a blatant attempt by the communists to spread communism throughout Europe. Okay, to spread communism. And finally, Stalin felt that he could only guarantee the support of his neighbours if they were Soviet-controlled governments. So there are three results of the Soviet expansion. Can I suggest you rewind this, make a few notes on it, make some cause, event, result card. Hopefully that clarifies a little bit for you. Please don't forget some of the key terminology. You have buffer zone, satellite states, rigged elections, occupation with Soviet troops, liberation of Eastern European states from Nazism, coalition governments and key positions being filled by communists, and the effects, the different view of what a sphere of influence actually is. Okay, hope that's been helpful. Bye-bye.